Hello, and welcome to Let's Meet the Virologists, a podcast about the people behind today's virology headlines, people just like you working to understand viruses and how they affect you. While our podcast has focused on coronavirus-related research over the past year, we are also interviewing researchers who study other viruses so that you can learn who they are and what they do. I am Larissa Thackeray, and I'm hosting this podcast from America's Heartland in St. Louis, Missouri. On March 24th, 2021, we talked with Dr. Hinissan Pascaline Kohio, a postdoctoral research associate in the Ding Lab at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, who has studied several different viruses. Pascaline got her MS in biology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she studied influenza host interactions in the lab of Dr. Amy Adamson. She then received her PhD in microbiology and immunology at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, where she studied HIV integration and latency in the lab of Dr. Stephen Barr. In early 2020, she worked as a postdoc in the Barr lab, repurposing a cancer therapeutic drug to potentially treat SARS-CoV-2. In the Ding lab, she is currently focusing on rotavirus, an enteric viral pathogen in young children, and how it interacts with the host's small intestine. Hi, Pascaline. I'm happy to have you with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you become interested in virology? What kind of background did you have that kind of got you to where you are today?
Sure. Thank you, Larissa, for having me today on this podcast. As you already mentioned, my name is Pascaline Kohio. I'm originally from Burkina Faso in Western Africa. So I did most of my primary and secondary school in Africa. And growing up there, I sort of noticed early on that the research program in my home country was really limited, like the different resources were not available at that time, most of them. And also I noticed that there was a lot of endemic diseases, especially infectious diseases. For instance, dengue, yellow fever, malaria, just to name a few. So that actually brought my interest in learning more about infectious diseases as a whole. And I was quite interested in the scientific aspect of that, learning more about the different processes that may lead to disease, and hoping to gather those knowledge and be able to contribute later on in the research program of my home country. So following my secondary school in Africa, since the educational program in my country was a little limited in the scientific aspect, there was not really a hands-on experience per se in research, just like the different lectures that were offered. So I wanted to move into an institution where I would be able to expand my knowledge into that and have more practical experience in the research field. So I moved to the United States of America, where I did my undergraduate in biology at Armstrong Atlantic State University in Savannah, Georgia. Now the name has changed, so it's under another name. So there I did my biology program and taking like several courses, and now sort of like narrowed down my interest, and I became more interested in focusing on virology specifically and learning more about the different mechanisms on how those pathogens interact with the host and might lead to diseases, and also how we can gather those information and to prevent further infection and hopefully lead to therapeutics as well. So following my undergraduate degree at Armstrong Atlantic State University, I moved to the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, where I did my Master of Science in Biology in the lab of Dr. Amy Adamson. There I mostly work on influenza infection, also looking at viral host cell interaction. And we had like some pretty good, like interesting study there. And we actually found that by regulating glucose metabolism, we can actually control influenza viral infection. That was quite interesting. So after my master again, I moved to another state, to another country, sorry. I actually moved to Canada, where I did my PhD at Western University in London, Ontario. And I work on HIV-1 infection in the lab of Dr. Stephen Barr. So on that particular project, so we focus on understanding how HIV latency, induce like latency, and what are like, is there like specifically something within the host genome where the virus may integrate itself and allow it to be latent and dormant, and doing a lot of sequencing analysis, bioinformatic analysis, working with patient sample. We're able to identify like a novel host protein that where the virus prefer to integrate itself to near. And this allowed the virus to like maintain those prolonged latency, and that's why most of the antiviral drugs are actually not effective against like curing the virus. So it was basically understanding this mechanism and how we can reactivate the latent pool and potentially clear the virus from infected individual. So before actually moving now to WashU to do my postdoc, during the pandemic, I was still in Canada, so I was able to have a short-term postdoctoral position within the same lab where I conducted my PhD. And then I was working on SARS-CoV for a brief time. It was about 4 months. And during that time, we were looking at different cancer drug, like a cancer drug, to see if we can repurpose that cancer drug to actually treat SARS-CoV. So on July of 2020, I left Canada, and now I moved back again to the US, where I'm currently in the lab of Dr. Xian Ding here, and I'm working on rotavirus infection. So basically, I will say that I've been moving around pretty much, trying like to gather expertise here and there, but that was quite a fun experience for me. Yeah.
So I guess sort of to follow up on that, when you were moving to these different places, like when you first came to the United States, or when you were choosing your different programs, how did you choose those specific programs or those specific labs? What did you look for as a student, you know, like in an environment that you wanted to move to?
Yeah. So after my undergrad, I was really interested in focusing on virology. So I started to look into like different programs that different schools offer. And I came across the lab of my PI Dan, and I was really fascinated about the work that she was doing, especially in terms of viral-host interaction. And I also wanted to focus on some of the pathogenic viruses that cause substantial public health burden. So that kind of like led me to like start off with like influenza. And when I joined the department, we actually had to go through lab rotation. So I did my laboratory rotation in her lab, and I also picked a couple of other laboratory lab rotation, but I ended up joining her lab again, because like as soon as like I started my rotation with her, I was really interested in the work, and I was also looking for an environment where there was a lot of like how can I put it, guidance, especially for someone that came freshly from undergrad that does not have a lot of hands-on laboratory research experience. So I felt more comfortable joining that lab as well. So moving on for my PhD, again, I wanted to focus on like pathogen that cause a lot of health burden. And I was also interested on the HIV-1, because that was also one of the predominant like infection currently in my home countries, and the fact that it's still actually a public health burden, and I wanted to understand more on the aspect of latency. That's why I decided to join the lab. The environment was also nice, and also moving from another country to the other, I wanted like to have that experience as well. I try to compare like the educational system in Canada and then the US, and and go from there. And then now I'm like back here in the United States. So for my postdoc, I wanted to gain more experience into working with animal model. And when I was looking for postdoctoral position here, I came across the research program of Dr. Dean here at WashU, and I was quite interested on the research program that he was like offering in his lab and getting that experience or expertise in working with animal model for infectious diseases was quite interesting to me. And also the different mechanism and platforms such as CRISPR screening and also proteomic analysis also caught my interest. That's why I contacted Dr. Dean, and he was quite responsive, and then everything went from there, and I'm here in St. Louis.
And I guess to follow up on that as well, do you think that there are unique challenges for someone like yourself who is coming from another country, especially one that's overseas, coming to do undergrad, graduate, or even postdoc in the United States or in Canada? Are there unique sort of challenges that you have to overcome?
Unique sort of, well, I will say when I moved from my undergrad to the US, I felt like that was like one of the biggest challenge because it's true that when I came, I did have my siblings, my elder siblings were already here, and one of my elder siblings I came with during that time. But the fact that I left my home country, that was quite challenging for me. So it took me about like a year to feel more comfortable into the new environment. And one of the biggest challenge for me was that the language barrier, even though I did have some experience like speaking in English, but it's a little different, like speaking English at the college level compared to everyday like speaking. So it took me some time also to adapt myself into the language and be more comfortable. So I think after a year, I was pretty comfortable. And the fact that I also stayed for several years in the US, moving to Canada, wasn't quite challenging at that time. I was already used to that.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about now, what's the virology research that you're doing now in this postdoc?
In this postdoc, sure. So in the lab of Dr. Dean, we are currently working on rotavirus infection. So before I joined the lab, there were previous findings from Dr. Dean where he did some proteomic analysis, and he actually found that the spike protein that is called VP4 from the rotavirus interacted with a host protein that plays an active role in cell migration and actin polymerization. And also, since during rotavirus infection, it tends to migrate, and most of the infection will occur at the apex of the villi. So we wanted to concentrate our study into that and see what is the main role that host protein play with rotavirus infection. And that project also was focusing on looking at its role in vivo as well as in vitro. So this is where the interest also came into. And one of the second projects that I'm currently working on came through some of the findings through CRISPR screen, where also that host protein was shown to have a role in rotavirus infection. So we move forward to look more into the mechanism of this interaction and the role that this protein play in rotavirus infection. So those two projects are pretty in the early stage of the study, but are providing quite interesting findings so far. And we hope to be able to have papers done and then publish sooner than later.
Yeah. So could you tell us a little bit, how do you study a virus like rotavirus? So when you talk about in vitro or in vivo studies, what kind of systems are you actually using?
So for in vitro study, we some of the variation we can use a a wild type strain of the virus. We also have some reverse genetic experiments that we did to modify like the genome of the virus, where we can like track the virus in vivo as well through specific staining for fluorescent protein. And also we do a lot of viral quantifications as well throughout this study.
And does the virus infect a specific type of cell?
Yeah, so the virus does mainly infect intestinal cells, epithelial cell of the small intestine. And so we primarily work with those type of cell, and there are also other type of cell that the virus can infect, that this is not really a cell that the virus will infect.
And then in vivo, do you have a small animal model of rotavirus infection, or are you developing it?
So for in general, we have like a model, a mouse model for rotavirus infection. We usually use the 129 strains that we use for our experiment. But going back to one of my projects, we haven't bought it yet, but there are actually mouse model where we can get that has deletion of that particular protein of interest that we could later use to have more specific analysis into our study, focusing on those particular protein as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you're just at the beginning, so that's very exciting. So I guess looking back so far, what has been the most exciting sort of observation you've had scientifically?
I think for me, I would probably say it was a couple of years back during my PhD. Actually, this was like one of the studies that was really not expected, because I started off with one particular area of my project. It was working pretty fine, but then later on, it was just like, I will say serendipity per se. So we just like tried some of the patient sample, and then we found like very interesting data into those, and that led like my project to move forward into that aspect of my disease, basically. So most of those data actually happened during the last year or so of my PhD, and these were quite fascinating. And the fact that I was also excited to be able to work with more with like sample, and that could be easily translated during like infection in human.
And I guess conversely, what's been the most difficult thing you've had to overcome as a scientist so far, and how did you overcome it?
Ooh, okay, so for me, I think I'm someone that can get easily impatient with my work. Because I like stuff to be done like a particular way. And then especially like with research, there are different challenges. And sometimes like your experiment will not move forward like the way you will want to do. And I get really impatient and frustrated. I will say that I haven't really, it's still a work in progress for me to be able to, to control myself and not get depressed or sad or think I'm like a failure because my experiment is not working. But one person that actually like helped me through this process is my PhD mentor, Dr. Stephen Barr. He's someone who is like really positive. He has like a positive view about like science and research in general. So whenever you come with like negative data, you're like sad and everything, he always like have this positive attitude that will like put you back up, and then you just continue with your work. And there was one quote from Thomas Edison that he really likes like to tell us is, I haven't found, I haven't failed, I just found like 10,000 ways that won't work. So he always keep like repeating that to me and also to my other lab mates then. So that was quite encouraging. So I believe like through him and the positive attitude, I sort of like got that from him. And then now I'm like more positive about like my work. If it doesn't fail, I don't like think it's the end of the world or something. Yeah.
I guess sort of following along with that, if you had a chance to ask your older self, so say you at 60 or 70, one question, what would it be? What would you want to know?
What I will want to know. I believe for me is I want to know if I feel fulfilled. For me, like being fulfilled is knowing that what your work that you have been doing had a positive impact on other people's life, and not only like work wise, but also in your personal life. Have you been like a positive person toward others? Have you been like kind toward others? Like I think like having this sense of fulfillment for me, this is one of the questions that I will ask myself in the older age. Yeah.
And just sort of to follow up on that, do you find ways, because science can be very consuming, do you find ways outside the lab to get that sense of fulfillment? And if so, how do you do it? Do you have hobbies or other things that you do?
Yes, I have some hobbies. I like to go out and walk, and I also like to work out at home. And I'm someone who it might be funny, but I like to clean. So when yeah, so sometimes like when I come from the lab and I feel a little depressed and tired, I just start cleaning and listening to music. It's a way of comforting to me. I don't know. It will sound weird, but yeah.
Um, and then I guess, so it'll be kind of interesting. So since you actually started out in Canada when the pandemic first started and then moved to the US, can you kind of describe how that was? What were the differences? How did it affect you as a person in the two different countries?
Yeah, because like I was still in Canada when everything pretty much started, and the thing was, I was planning to come to the US to start my postdoc, and everything got delayed, so I stayed in Canada. That didn't happen, and also during that time period, my best friends was getting married in my home country. I couldn't attend because of everything. It was quite challenging, and also being by myself. Like I was the only member of my family living in Canada, even though I had friends, but everyone pretty much went to the parent house. So I was just there in the apartment. It was a little bit challenging at first, and always being also stuck and listening to news didn't help also. Yeah, that didn't really help as well. But talking to family members back home and being in touch with friends and loved one really helped me through these challenges, even though I was back in Canada on my own. So when I moved to the US, I was pretty okay so far dealing with the different challenges of the pandemic. And also, Dr. Dean was like really supportive and helping me like to adapt like to the pandemic just coming like into it like that. So that was quite helpful.
And how about, do you still have family back home? How's the pandemic been for them?
Yeah, I still have my family back home. I have my siblings there, and my mom is still back home. My dad passed away. He was still like back home too. Um, so early on, I think the government actually took the pandemic seriously. Like there were like curfew, there were like certain times of the day where people were not allowed to stay outside. So that pretty much like helped to curve down like the pandemic. And also having like strict regulation, like when people were not following that, they may get fined or something like that. So people were like forced to like follow the guidelines and everything. Lately, however, we started to see a little increase in the cases. So I believe currently we are above 11,000 cases and 350 or so cases, active cases. The cases are starting to rise slowly, but I think the government will hopefully like continue to push forward into the guideline and make sure everything doesn't escalate.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's very different now is obviously in the US, we obviously had many issues with, rampant infection, but now we've actually, really started vaccinating people. And so we've got this cohort of people that are vaccinated. How back home do you have access to vaccines in your country or no?
Oh, at the moment, they don't have access to the vaccine, but some of the neighboring countries did started their vaccinations. Yeah.
So so how does that make you feel in a way that I assume you were offered the vaccine working at the university, but that your family members, I mean, I think they're talking in the news that some countries may not get access to vaccines until like 2023, something like that. What do you think about that? How does that make you feel?
It's not a pleasant situation. I would have wished that like everyone could have access to the vaccine, and I do hope that our government would do everything possible and acquire some vaccine, at least to give those to the most vulnerable population in my country. So that will be quite essential.
Okay, so as a virologist, how have you thought about the way that you move around in society, whether to get vaccinated or not? How do you think about things like that?
For me, I'm like someone who's like really follow guidelines. I'm like really strict into those, and I try to talk to loved one and family to make sure that they stick to those guidelines to protect not only themselves but others as well. With respect to the vaccine, for me actually, at first, I was a little bit hesitant, but I did took the time and then read all the protocols that were offered and available to the public. And from there, I made my decision to get my doses, and also getting like advice from my uncle, who is also a little bit in the science field, who recommended that it will be a good idea if I'm offered the opportunity to take one, I should go ahead and do so. Yeah.
And I guess back in your home country, how do they view vaccination in general?
Talking to my mom lately, it seems that most people are really hesitant sometimes about the vaccine, but I try to make her understand, no, people don't have to be hesitant. Like, if us, we are taking it and we are fine, how come, like, if others take it, they won't be okay? It's not like something to be hesitant from taking. But sometimes I do understand like people point of view. Some of them may not have like a full understanding of like how vaccine are developed. So it's sort of like cause this hesitancy also to our vaccine, not only for COVID, but other vaccines in general.
When you're talking to her, like what kind of, or what are her concerns in a way, and how do you sort of talk about that?
For me, talking to people from my home country, I believe one of the major concerns are the long-term side effects, not the short-term side effects. Some people think that maybe down the line, like years from now, they may experience some severe side effects that may affect their life in general. So that's why there are more hesitant to take the vaccine. But I'm trying to make them understand, no, this won't happen. You should be okay. Yeah.
Great. So I guess any last messages for our listeners? I'm kind of interested in, for you, like what really was sort of the spark in the beginning? So what set you off on this path of being a virologist?
What really set me off into this path is just seeing like the different endemic diseases in my home country. I wanted to be able to, like, after my academic and professional career, I wanted to be able like to come back in my home country and to be able to help within that particular area of science that is not well developed in my country. So this is basically one of the major goal and the things that like really push me into that field specifically.
So I guess looking into the future, are you thinking that you would go back to your country to set up your lab there, or do you want to have a lab elsewhere and work on diseases that are applicable to your country? What do you see happening?
So what I'm seeing happening is first get all the professional experience I could get like outside of my country. Even if down the line I'm still outside of my country, I'm hoping to be able to establish a lab in my home country where I could work in collaboration with other scientists and researchers and just like travel back and forth between the two countries. And I did notice a lot of like researchers do those kind of work in the field. So this is how I want like to split my expertise back home and in a foreign country.
Well, I wish you the best. It was nice talking to you today.
Thank you.
Pascaline hopes to establish her own lab in the future, focusing on viruses that impact people in her home country. This has been Let's Meet the Virologist, a podcast about people who study viruses. This is your host, Larissa Thackeray, and thanks for listening. You can find us on Google, Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, and other podcasts, or at lmtv.podbean.com.